What I felt was the specific, quiet weight of understanding that some things cannot be undone. That recognition, when it arrives 7 years too late, dressed in paperwork and fluorescent lighting, is not the same thing as healing. It is just recognition. And recognition, it turns out, is not enough. If you're interested in this gist, hit the like button, subscribe, and type interested in the comments, and I will give you a heart. My name is Zara Mensicole. I am 36 years old. I am a court-appointed bankruptcy trustee licensed in 3 states. I have overseen the dissolution of 41 companies in 9 years. I own 23 properties across Texas, Georgia, and Tennessee under a holding company called Meridian Coal Properties. My mother thinks I work a mid-level analyst job at a firm downtown. She thought that for 7 years. She was wrong about almost everything she believed about me. And on a Tuesday morning in March, she sat in a federal courtroom in Houston and found out exactly how wrong. This is not a story about revenge. I need you to understand that before we go any further. I have had 7 years to turn this into a revenge story, and I have refused every time because revenge requires you to keep looking backward. And I stopped looking backward a long time ago. This is a story about what happens when the truth finally arrives, about what it costs, about what it cannot fix no matter how cleanly or how completely it lands. Stay with me. Before I go any further, where are you watching this right now? What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments because this story is going to ask something from you. It is going to ask you to hold 2 things at the same time: the justice of what happened and the grief of it. Both things are true. Both things matter. My father, Emmanuel Mensah, came to Houston from Ibadan in 1984 with an engineering degree, a leather briefcase, and the specific brand of Nigerian ambition that does not announce itself because it is too busy working. He was a quiet man, deliberate, the kind of father who showed love through presence rather than expression. He was simply always there, at the dinner table, at the school gate, in the chair beside the bed when you were sick. He didn't say much, but the quality of his attention was total. When my father listened to you, you felt like the only person in the world whose words had weight. He built Mensah Import and Export from a single trade agreement with a textile supplier in Lagos into a mid-sized logistics company with 12 employees and contracts in 4 countries. He built it over 20 years. He built it the same way he did everything, quietly, without announcement, by showing up every single day and doing the work with more care than the situation required. He died of a heart attack at 62, in his office, at his desk, working. That was 6 years ago. My mother, Ajinola, was the other kind of Nigerian parent entirely. I want to be precise about her because imprecision would be unfair. My mother was not a cruel woman. She was not a woman who woke up in the morning and decided to cause damage. She was a woman of enormous social intelligence and almost zero awareness of the distance between the performance of love and its actual practice. She loved her children the way her community had taught her to love them, loudly, publicly, through the proxy of their achievements. When my brother Khalad got into the University of Texas, she called every member of her church and her women's group and her husband's business contacts within 24 hours. When he got his MBA, she threw a party that cost more than my first semester's tuition. When he gave a speech at a community dinner at 32, she sat in the front row with an expression that was not just pride. It was ownership. Khalad was what she had built. His success was her success. His achievements were the return on the investment of her sacrifice, and she wore them the way other women wear jewelry, as evidence of a life well constructed. And then there was me. I was the second child, 3 years younger than Khalad. I was a different kind of child from the beginning, quieter in social situations, louder in my opinions, interested in things that didn't fit the family's preferred narrative of success. I liked numbers, not in the abstract, mathematical way that Nigerian parents celebrate. I liked the way numbers told stories. I liked understanding why money moved the way it moved. I liked reading financial statements the way other people read novels. Looking for the plot underneath the figures, the character in the decisions, the tension between what the numbers said and what the people running the company believed. My father understood this about me. In the specific, wordless way he understood most things. My mother did not know what to do with it. She needed my success to be legible, to be the kind of thing she could translate for her community. Doctor, lawyer, engineer, professor, something with a title that people recognized, that required a specific path, that could be pointed to at a dinner table and understood. What I wanted to do with my life was not that kind of thing. And so we arrived, by the time I was finishing my undergraduate degree, at the first of many dinner table conversations that had the shape of interest and the weight of verdict. It was a Sunday, July. Houston in July is a specific kind of brutal. The heat doesn't just sit on you, it enters you. And by evening, even the air conditioning feels like it is only managing the emergency rather than resolving it. My mother had cooked. She always cooked on Sundays. Jollof rice, fried plantain, stew that had been on since morning. The smells filling the house with the specific warmth that made it home regardless of everything else. Khalad was there with his wife, Bunmi, 2 children already, a third on the way. He sat at the table with the ease of a man who understood that this was his natural environment, the center of his mother's attention, the subject of her most enthusiastic sentences. I had come home to tell them I was leaving the financial firm where I had been working since graduation, that I had decided to build something of my own, that I had found a property, a duplex in a neighborhood outside Houston, that I was going to purchase as my first investment, that I had been studying this for 2 years, that I had a plan. I told them over the jollof rice. My mother put down her fork. She looked at me for a moment, the specific look of a woman translating something from a language she doesn't speak. And then she said, calmly, with the particular kindness that is the most cutting kind, "Zara, a duplex. You want to leave a good job to buy a duplex." I said, "It's the beginning of a portfolio. I have a strategy." A portfolio. She repeated the word the way people repeat words they don't trust. Khalad has a business. Your cousin Temi is finishing her residency. You want to buy a duplex in where? Katie. She looked at Khalad. He looked at his plate. She said, "Your father built this family with real work, with something that employed people, with something that could be passed on. You want to leave a stable salary to buy a house and rent it to strangers." I said, "That is a simplification of what I'm not simplifying." Her voice was still warm. That was the specific skill of Aginola Mensa. She could deliver a verdict in a warm voice and make you feel that the warmth was genuine even as the verdict landed. "I'm saying what I see, and what I see worries me. You have always been difficult to direct, Zara. Always. Your father was patient with it. I have been patient with it. But you are 29 years old, and you are talking about renting a house in Katy." She picked up her fork. She said, "I expected more." Those 3 words, "I expected more." Delivered over jollof rice on a Sunday in July with the ceiling fan turning above us, and Khalad looking at his plate and Bunmi reaching for the plantain. That was the first year. I am not going to give you all 7 years in detail. I am going to give you the shape of them, the recurring pattern, the specific ritual of disappointment that my mother performed at every gathering, every phone call, every family event for 7 years, with such consistency that it stopped being personal and became structural. The way weather is not personal but still determines the condition of everything it falls on. Year 1. I bought the duplex. I managed it myself. I studied every evening on top of my analyst job, learning property management, lease law, contractor relationships, the specific mathematics of cash flow that tells you whether an investment is performing or simply consuming. I told no one, not because I was hiding anything, because I had understood from that July dinner table that the only language my mother would accept was a result, not a plan, not a strategy, a result so undeniable that it required no translation. Year 2, I bought 2 more properties, one in Houston, one in San Antonio. I restructured my analyst job to part-time by quietly building a consulting practice that paid more per hour than the full-time salary. I hired my first property manager. My mother called on my birthday and asked how the job was going. I said fine. She said Khalad had just won a new contract. I said that was wonderful. She said she hoped I was thinking about stability. I said I was. That was the full conversation. Year 3, I quit the analyst job entirely. I built Meridian Coal Properties as a formal LLC. I took on my first external consulting client, a small firm in Dallas that needed help restructuring their asset holdings. I drove to the family home for Christmas in a car I had paid for in cash. My mother admired Bun Mi's new jewelry for 20 minutes. She asked me once if I was seeing anyone. I said no. She sighed in the specific way that contained an entire paragraph. Year 4, 6 properties, 2 states, a net income that had crossed into territory I would not have believed 4 years earlier. I attended my cousin Temmie's graduation from medical residency. My mother stood beside Temmie's mother at the reception, and I heard her say, not to me, past me, in the way people speak when they want to be overheard. Some children find their path early. Some take longer. We just keep praying. She was looking at me when she said longer. I smiled. I got more food. Year 5. My father's company started showing stress. I noticed it at the edges of conversations. Khalad's responses getting shorter when money came up. My mother's mentions of the business becoming less frequent and less specific. I asked Khalad directly at a family dinner if everything was fine. He said yes with the particular speed of a man who has been waiting for the question and prepared the answer in advance. I did not push. I filed it away. There was a moment at that dinner, a small moment, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that I keep returning to. My mother was talking about the business, describing a contract Khalad had secured the way she always described his wins, with the specific vocabulary of investment and pride. And Khalad was nodding, adding details, building the picture. And I watched him from across the table, and I noticed something I had never noticed before. He was watching her, not listening to her, watching her the way a person watches an audience they are performing for, tracking the response rather than inhabiting the content. There was something in the watching that was separate from the performance, something careful, almost strategic. I knew that look. I had seen it in boardrooms, in depositions, in the faces of executives explaining quarterly results that did not match the actual accounts. I filed it away. Year 6. My mother called me on a Wednesday evening. This was unusual. She called on Sundays, always, the weekly check-in that followed the same script regardless of content. A Wednesday call meant something had broken the routine. She said, "Zara, I need to ask you something." I said, "Of course." She said, "Do you have money saved? Are you comfortable?" Something in her voice was different, not warm, not the performing warmth of the dinner table verdict, just tired. Just a mother on a Wednesday evening asking her daughter a question she had never asked before in 7 years. I said, "I am fine, Mama." She said, "I only asked because things are tight right now. With the business. Khalad is managing it, but it has been a difficult year, and I just wanted to know you were stable." I said, "I am stable." She said, "Good. That's good." She did not ask what I meant by stable. She did not ask how stable. She accepted the word and moved on because accepting the word was easier than the conversation that would follow if she pulled on it. I gave her the word. I sat in my apartment after that call and thought about what I had just done. What it meant to give someone enough truth to be reassured without giving them enough truth to understand. I also knew that my mother had been doing the same thing to me for 6 years, giving me enough of a response at dinner tables and on Sunday calls to perform connection without creating it. We were more alike in that moment than either of us knew. That thought was not comfortable. I opened the spreadsheet. I looked at the properties. I looked at the number at the bottom. Then I opened a second window and pulled up the public financial filings for Mensa Import and Export. I had been monitoring them quietly for 2 years. I read the latest filing carefully. I made notes. I closed the laptop and went to bed. Year 7. I became a licensed bankruptcy trustee. This is not a coincidence. I want to be clear about that. I had been building toward the trustee qualification for 2 years. It was a natural extension of the restructuring work I had been doing for clients, companies in distress, assets that needed independent oversight, situations where someone with no stake in the outcome needed to come in and see clearly. I was good at it, extraordinarily good at it, because I had spent my entire professional life learning how to see clearly in situations where everyone else's vision was compromised by what they needed to be true. I had learned that from my family. I want you to think about that sentence. I had learned to see clearly, the skill that made me exceptional at my work from years of sitting at a family table where what people needed to be true and what was actually true were two completely different things. From years of watching my mother translate the world into the version that served her narrative. From years of being the person in the room whose version of reality was never the one that got spoken aloud. Watching people refuse to see clearly for long enough teaches you how to see clearly better than anything else can. I passed my trustee examinations in October of year 7. I opened the results on my phone in the parking lot of a grocery store. I called no one. I drove home. I made dinner. I added the qualification to my firm's documentation. 3 states. A mother who still believed her daughter worked an analyst job downtown. You have been watching this build. You have been watching a woman construct something extraordinary in complete silence, while the people closest to her constructed a story about her failure and repeated it at every available opportunity. I want to ask you, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments right now, why do you think she never told them? She had the evidence. She had the numbers. She had, by year 3, more than enough to silence every dinner table verdict her mother had ever delivered. Why didn't she? Think about it. Sit with it. Because the answer to that question tells you everything about who Zara Mensah actually is. And I am not going to give you the answer yet. We keep going. My brother Khalad had been drowning for 4 years before anyone outside the company knew it. I want you to understand the specific architecture of how a man like Khalad drowns. He did not make one catastrophic decision. He made a series of small decisions, each one individually defensible, each one made in the service of keeping the surface appearance of competence intact, that accumulated over 4 years into something that could not be managed anymore. He lost the company's 2 largest contracts in year 1 of his management, not through negligence exactly, but through the specific overconfidence of a man who had been told his whole life that his intelligence was sufficient for any situation and had therefore never developed the discipline to prepare for situations where intelligence alone was not enough. He replaced the contracts with smaller ones, more of them, which required more management infrastructure than the company had. He hired people he couldn't afford to keep the appearance of growth. He took a business loan using the family home as collateral, something my father had specifically, in writing, told him never to do, without telling my mother what the collateral was. And then he did what people like Khalad always do when the walls are closing. He kept performing. He kept showing up at family dinners with the easy confidence of a man whose business was thriving. He kept giving my mother the quarterly summary she asked for in numbers that did not match the actual accounts. He kept accepting the community's admiration and my mother's pride, and the specific validation of being the child who was carrying the family's legacy forward. He wore the performance the way he had always worn it, comfortably, naturally, without apparent effort. Until he couldn't. The final crack came in the form of a federal tax lien. The company had been behind on payroll taxes for 18 months, the kind of debt that accumulates quietly and then surfaces with the specific violence of a thing that has been ignored past the point of management. The IRS filed. The creditors who had been patient became impatient. Two of them filed simultaneously. The company's accounts were frozen before Khalad had told my mother anything. She found out the way people find out things that have been hidden from them by people they trusted. She found out from someone else. A woman from her church, a woman she had known for 20 years, whose husband had a passing connection to one of the creditors, called my mother on a Thursday morning to ask, with the careful, church-appropriate concern of a woman who is also absolutely thrilling in the information she is about to deliver, whether Aginola was all right, whether the family was managing, whether there was anything the congregation could do. My mother did not know what the woman was talking about. She called Khalad. He told her, "I want you to imagine that phone call. Not the one between Khalad and my mother. The one between my mother and me." 40 minutes later, when she had absorbed what her son had just told her and picked up the phone with the specific desperation of a woman whose carefully constructed world has just been informed it is built on something that was never as solid as she believed. She called me. She said, "Zara." Just my name. Nothing else for a moment. Just my name, in a voice I had not heard from her before. Not the warm verdict voice. Not the tired Wednesday voice. Something underneath both of those. Something stripped of performance. I said, "Mama, what happened?" Not a question. I already knew it was not going to be a question. She told me, in pieces, the way people tell things that are too large to say in one direction. The lien, the creditors, the home, the accounts, Khalad's months of silence, the woman from the church, the specific humiliation, and I want you to hold this. The specific humiliation of finding out your world is ending from a woman who has been your social equal for 20 years and who will now, permanently, have the advantage of having known before you did. For my mother, I believe that last part was as devastating as anything else. I listened. I let her talk. When she stopped, I said, "I hear you, Mama." She said, do you know anyone? Anyone who might be able to help? A lawyer or... I said, "Let me look into it." She said, "Khalad says it may be too far gone, that they may have to file." I said, "If they file, the court will appoint a trustee." She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means someone independent comes in and manages the process. Make sure everything is handled correctly, fairly." She said, "Will that person help us?" I said, "That person's job is to be fair, not to help, to be fair." There was a silence. Then my mother said, "I should have handled this differently. With Khalad, I should have asked harder questions." It was the closest thing to self-reflection I had heard from her in 7 years. Delivered quietly, in a phone call about her company's bankruptcy, stripped of the warmth and the performance. I said, "File the paperwork, Mama. Get it started. Things will become clearer once the process begins." We hung up. I sat in my office, my actual office, the one my mother had never seen, the one that looked out over downtown Houston from the 14th floor of a building I partially owned, and I looked at the city for a long time. Then I opened my laptop, and I began to prepare. Here is what I need you to understand about what happened next. I did not arrange to be appointed trustee of my family's case. I want to be precise about this because the family's version of events, as it developed in the weeks after the court appointment, was that I had engineered it, that I had used my connections, my knowledge, my position to place myself in that room, that the daughter who had always been difficult had finally found a way to make the difficulty official. That is not what happened. What happened is that the court pulls from a roster of qualified trustees based on case complexity, jurisdiction, and availability. The Mensa import and export case was a mid-sized commercial filing in the Southern District of Texas. My firm was on the roster. I was the available trustee with the most directly relevant experience in logistics company restructuring. The court called my name because I was the most qualified person for the job. That is the truth. What is also true, and I am telling you this because I promised you honesty, is that I had known for approximately 6 weeks before the filing that the filing was coming. I had known because I had been watching the company's public financial signals for 2 years, and the pattern was not ambiguous to someone who knew how to read it. I had known because the woman from my mother's church was not the only person in Houston's Nigerian community whose husband had a passing connection to the creditors. I had known, and I had not recused myself from the roster. I did not arrange to be there, but I did not arrange not to be there. There is a difference between those two things, and the difference is the question I have been living inside ever since. The letter from the court came on a Monday. I read it twice. Then I picked up the phone and called the one person in my life who knew the full picture, my friend and colleague, Dara, who had been with me since the early consulting days and who understood both the professional and the personal dimensions of what this letter represented. I read her the appointment notice. There was a silence on the line. Then Dara said, "Zara." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you want to recuse?" I thought about that for a long time, longer than the pause that I allowed before answering. I said, "The conflict of interest rules require me to disclose the family relationship to the court. The court then decides whether it constitutes sufficient cause for recusal." Dara said, "That is not what I asked you." I said, "I know." Another silence. I said, "My mother's company, my brother's decisions, my family's consequences. The court chose the most qualified trustee on the roster. I am that trustee. My job is to be fair." Dara said, "Your job is also to be honest about whether you can be fair." I said, "I have been being fair to this family for 7 years while they were not being fair to me. I think I know how to do it." Dara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, but Zara, tell me honestly, is this about the job or about the room?" I did not answer that question. I disclosed the family relationship to the court as required. The court reviewed the disclosure. The court determined that a professional relationship in a legal proceeding, governed by federal oversight and subject to judicial review, did not constitute automatic grounds for recusal, particularly given my qualifications and the absence of any financial stake in the outcome. The appointment stood. I called my mother that evening. She did not know yet. She would find out when the formal notification arrived. I said, "Mama, I need to tell you something about the case." She said, "What is it?" I said, "The court has appointed a trustee." She said, "Yes, Khalad said this would happen." I said, "Mama, I am the trustee." The silence that followed that sentence was the longest silence I have ever sat inside. Longer than the ones at dinner tables. Longer than the ones on Sunday calls. A silence with a different quality than anything that had come before. The silence of a world rearranging itself inside a person in real time. My mother said, "You." I said, "Yes." She said, "You are, how are you?" And then she stopped. And I could hear, in the stopping, the exact moment when she began to understand that the question she was trying to ask was connected to a much larger question that she had been not asking for 7 years. She said, "Zara, what do you do? What do you actually do?" I said, "We can talk about that. But right now I need you to hear me clearly. I am the trustee assigned to this case by the federal court. That means my obligation is to the court and to the fair administration of this proceeding. Not to the family, not to Khalad, not to you, to the process. Do you understand what I am telling you? She said, yes. I said, good. She said, Zara. I said, Mama, I have to go. I'll see you in court. I hung up. I sat in my office for a long time. 3 states. A mother who had just learned, in a 3-minute phone call, that the daughter she had called a disappointment for 7 years was a federally appointed bankruptcy trustee overseeing the ruins of everything the family had built. Outside the window, Houston continued being Houston, loud, enormous, indifferent. I went back to work. And I need to know what you are feeling right now. Not what you think you should feel, what you actually feel. Because I have told this story to people before. Not the full version, pieces of it. And what I have found is that people split into 2 camps at this moment. There are people who feel that what I am about to describe is justice, clean, earned, deserved. And there are people who feel something more complicated, who are starting to ask a question they are not sure they are allowed to ask. Both of those responses are correct. Federal Bankruptcy Court, Southern District of Texas, Courtroom 4, Tuesday morning, 8:45. I arrived early because I always arrive early. I set up at the trustees' table, documents organized in the specific order I have developed over 41 cases. A system so practiced it is now closer to ritual than process. I arranged my files. I uncapped my pen. I looked at the room. It was a standard federal courtroom. Not large, not dramatic. The kind of room that does not care about the weight of what happens inside it. The fluorescent lights are the same fluorescent lights regardless of whether the proceeding is routine or devastating. I had been in this specific courtroom 11 times before. I knew the angle of the light in the morning. I knew which chair at the trustees' table gave you the best sight line to both the judge and the debtor's table. I knew that the clerk, a woman named Patricia who had been in this building for 22 years, always arrived 8 minutes before the session and organized her station in the same sequence every time. I knew this room the way you know any room you have worked in for years, with the specific bodily familiarity of a space that has become part of your professional identity. I knew this room. What I did not know, sitting there at 8:45, was what it was going to feel like when my mother walked through that door. I had prepared for the case. I had prepared for every document, every creditor claim, every procedural motion. I had prepared, as I always prepared, for every professional contingency. I had not fully prepared for that door opening. I sat at the trustees' table and I looked at my documents and I let myself feel, for exactly 2 minutes, everything I had kept at professional distance for the previous 3 weeks since the appointment. The dinner table in July, the ceiling fan, the jollof rice, 7 years of Sunday calls, the Wednesday call in year 6, the word disappointment moving through the family, like weather for so long it had stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like climate. 2 minutes. Then I put it away. I have learned in 9 years of this work that feelings are not the enemy of clarity. Suppressed feelings are. Felt feelings, properly contained, become information. And information in a federal courtroom is everything. At 8:58, the door opened. My mother walked in. She was wearing the dark blue dress she wore to my father's funeral. I recognized it immediately, and the recognition landed somewhere in my chest before I could prevent it. That specific, involuntary response to a garment associated with grief, worn again in a different room for a different loss. She was with Aunt Bisoy. Bisoy had always been the one my mother brought when she needed not to be alone. The sister who was present for everything and said nothing that mattered, who witnessed without intervening, whose support was the support of physical presence rather than actual engagement. They walked in. They found their seats on the other side of the aisle. My mother looked at me. I want to describe that look precisely because imprecision would be a disservice to what it contained. It was not the look she gave me at dinner tables. That look had always been the look of a director assessing an actor who keeps missing the scene. This was different. This was the look of a woman who had walked into a room expecting one version of reality and found another, and was in the process, in real time, of revising everything she thought she knew about the person sitting 20 feet away from her. She looked at the table, at the documents, at the pen in my hand, at the way I was sitting, not anxious, not performing, simply present and prepared in the specific way of someone who belongs exactly where they are. She took in every detail the way she had always taken in details, quickly, completely, with the assessment running behind her eyes, even when her expression was still. And then something happened in her face that I had never seen before. It was brief, a second, maybe less. The kind of expression that the face makes before the person controlling the face has time to manage it. It looked like grief. Not grief for the company, not grief for the house. Grief for something that cannot be itemized in a bankruptcy filing. For the years, for the dinner tables, for the specific, irreversible cost of a word used repeatedly in a warm voice by someone who believed they were telling the truth. I held her gaze for one moment. Then I looked down at my documents. The judge entered. We rose. I am going to tell you what happened in that courtroom with the precision it deserves. Not dramatized, not simplified. The actual mechanics of what the proceeding looked like and what it meant. The judge reviewed the case summary. The debts of Mensa Import and Export totaled $2,340,000 across 7 creditors. The assets, equipment, inventory, receivables, the building the company operated from, had a liquidation value of approximately $800,000. The family home, pledged as collateral on the primary business loan, was subject to creditor claim. The family home, my mother's house, the house where the jollof rice had been cooking on Sunday mornings for 30 years. The house with the ceiling fan above the dinner table where the word disappointment had entered the room. That house was on the table. My job, my actual federal court-mandated job, was to oversee the fair distribution of available assets to the creditors according to the priority structure that bankruptcy law establishes. My personal feelings about the house were not part of that job. My history with the family was not part of that job. My 7 years of Sunday calls and dinner table verdicts and quiet, patient, invisible building, none of that was part of that job. The law is the law. The law is the law. Khalad sat at the debtor's table with his attorney. He had not looked at me since entering the room. His attorney, a man named Gerald Park, who I had appeared against twice before in other proceedings and who I knew to be competent and thorough, had reviewed my appointment disclosure and raised no objection. He was a professional. He understood that the appointment was legitimate. The proceeding moved through its initial phases with the specific, unhurried pace of federal court. The judge asked questions. I presented the trustee's preliminary assessment. Gerald Park responded on behalf of the debtor. The creditor's representative sat in a row along the far wall with the patient, contained attention of people who have done this before and understand that patience in this room is eventually rewarded. And through all of it, through every document presented and every question answered and every administrative motion recorded by the clerk, my mother sat in the gallery with Aunt Bisoy and watched her youngest daughter run the proceeding. A mother who had spent 7 years constructing a story about her daughter's inadequacy. A daughter who had spent 7 years building the credentials that would one day make her the most powerful person in a room her family desperately needed to go well. The gap between those two things, between the story and the reality, filling that courtroom with a silence that the fluorescent lights and the administrative language did nothing to address. At one point, the judge asked me a procedural question about the timeline for the asset valuation. I answered it. The judge nodded. Gerald Park made a note. The clerk typed. My mother's hands were clasped in her lap. She had not moved them since sitting down. There was a recess at 11:15. In federal court, a recess is an administrative pause. 15 minutes. People stretch, check phones, confer with counsel. The trustee reviews documents and prepares for the next phase. I walked out of the courtroom through the side door and down the corridor to the window at the far end. I always do this during recesses in difficult cases. Not to collect myself. I had collected myself before walking into the courtroom. But because standing at a window looking at something outside the building reminds me that the building is not the whole world. That the proceeding, however significant, exists inside a city that contains an enormous amount of life that has nothing to do with what is being decided in that room. Houston below me. Traffic. A food truck on the corner. A woman in a yellow coat walking a dog with the specific, purposeful stride of someone who has somewhere to be. The city doing what cities do, continuing, indifferent, enormous, full. I was looking at the woman in the yellow coat when I heard footsteps behind me. I knew before I turned. My mother stood at the end of the corridor. She had left Biso in the gallery. She had walked the full length of the building to find me. I want you to understand what that walk means for a woman like Agenola Mensah. She was not a woman who walked toward difficult conversations. She was a woman who placed difficult conversations inside other conversations, inside meals, inside phone calls that had been scheduled for different purposes. She managed confrontation by embedding it in warmth until the confrontation became undeniable even through the warmth. She did not seek out hard moments in federal courthouse corridors during recesses. She walked the full length of that building to find me. She was still in the dark blue dress. Her hands were at her sides, not clasped, not in front of her, just at her sides, which told me something. Her hands, when she was managing her presentation, were always deliberately positioned. Hands at the sides meant she had stopped managing. She looked smaller than she had looked at the dinner table. Not physically smaller. Something about the way she was standing, a compression, as if the performance that had held her upright for 30 years was still present but costing more than it ever had before. As if the posture was the same, but the thing supporting it from the inside was less certain than it had been. She said, Zara. I said, Mama. We shouldn't be speaking privately during the proceeding. She said, I know. She stopped. Started again. I need to say something. I waited. She said, I did not know. What you had built. What you were doing. I did not. She pressed her lips together. 7 years. And I never, she stopped again. I want you to understand what it means for a woman like my mother to stop in the middle of a sentence. She was precise with language the way my father was precise with numbers. She did not lose sentences. She constructed them carefully and delivered them in the warm, managed voice of a woman who understood that words were tools and tools should be used with intention. She lost that sentence twice. I want to tell you what I felt in that corridor, because I have thought about it many times since, and I have been as honest with myself as I know how to be. I felt the thing I had spent 7 years not allowing myself to feel in her presence. Not the anger. The anger had dissolved long ago into something more useful. Not the grief. The grief had become the engine of the building. Something underneath both of those. Something that had no clean name. The specific, unresolvable ache of a daughter standing in a corridor with her mother and understanding, with total clarity, that the moment they were in was not the moment either of them had needed it to be. She needed it to be a reconciliation, a turning point. The scene from the story she had been revising in her head since the Wednesday call in year 6, since the phone call 3 weeks ago, since she had walked into that courtroom and seen her daughter at the trustees' table and understood. In the space of 3 seconds, the full distance between the story she had been telling about me and the reality I had been living. She needed the corridor to be the beginning of something. And I was standing there in a federal courthouse, mid-proceeding, with 12 minutes left in a recess and a room full of creditors and a judge who was waiting for the next phase. And I could not give her that beginning. Not in that corridor. Not in those 12 minutes. Not with the blue dress and the lost sentences and the hands at her sides. Maybe not yet anywhere. I said, "Mama, I have to go back in." She said, "Zara, I'm sorry." 2 words. I'm sorry. The words I had constructed an entire professional life in the absence of. The words that I had at various points in the previous 7 years imagined receiving in different contexts, at a dinner table, in a phone call, in a letter delivered on a Sunday. I had imagined the feeling of receiving them so many times that the imagining had become a kind of rehearsal. The reality of them, in a courthouse corridor in a dark blue funeral dress, did not feel like the rehearsal. It felt smaller and larger, both at the same time. Smaller because the setting stripped everything decorative from the moment. Larger because she had walked the full length of the building to say them, and I knew, from 36 years of knowing her, what that walk had cost her. I looked at my mother. I said, "I hear you, Mama." Not "I forgive you." Not "it's okay." Not the response that the scene seemed to be asking for. Not the response that would have allowed her to walk back into that courtroom, having received something that closed a distance. "I hear you." She nodded. Once. Slowly. The nod of a woman who understood that what she had received was honest. That honest, in this particular moment, was more than she had earned and less than she needed, and exactly what the situation actually was. I turned and walked back toward the courtroom. At the door I stopped. I don't know why. Something made me stop. I looked back down the corridor. My mother was still standing at the window, looking out at the city. Her hands were still at her sides. Her back was to me. She looked, from that distance, like a woman who had been standing at windows her whole life, and only now understood what she had been looking for. I went back into the courtroom. Patricia the clerk looked up when I came in. She nodded once, the nod of a professional who has seen everything and comments on nothing. I sat down. I uncapped my pen. I looked at my documents. The judge entered. We rose. "I am going to tell you what happened with the case. You deserve the full picture. The asset liquidation process took 4 months. The equipment and inventory realized slightly more than projected, $640,000 after fees. The receivables collected partially, $112,000. The building sold at a modest discount to a buyer I found through my own network, a logistics company that acquired the lease and the remaining contract simultaneously, which preserved 3 of the company's 12 jobs in the transition. That mattered to me. I want you to know that it mattered to me. The family home. The primary creditor had a legitimate, documented claim. The home had been pledged as collateral. The law was clear. I executed my obligation. The house sold in month 3. My mother moved into a smaller apartment in a neighborhood she had never imagined living in. She took what she could. She left what she couldn't. I want to be very precise about something. There was nothing I could have done within the boundaries of my role that would have changed the outcome for that house. The collateral was the collateral. The debt was the debt. The law is the law. What I could have done and did not do was something outside the boundaries of my role. I could have purchased that property myself through Meridian Coal. I had the capital. I had done it with other distressed properties before. I could have bought it, held it, and offered my mother a lease. I did not do that. Was it because the conflict of interest would have compromised the proceeding? Was it because she needed to feel the full weight of what had been lost through other people's decisions, Khalad's decisions, her own decisions about Khalad, and purchasing the property would have cushioned that weight in a way that served neither of us honestly? Was it because I was still, underneath all of it, the daughter standing at the dinner table in July being told I was not enough? I don't know. I genuinely do not know. And I think the not knowing is the most honest thing I can offer you. The case closed in month 5. I filed the final trustee report with the court. The creditors received their distributions according to the priority structure. Gerald Park submitted the debtor's final documentation. The judge signed the discharge. Mensa Import and Export ceased to exist as a legal entity on a Thursday afternoon. The clerk recorded it. The docket was closed. The fluorescent lights continued doing what they had always done. I drove home. I sat in my apartment, the apartment my mother had never visited, in the building I partially owned, and I looked at my city through the window for a long time. Then I opened the spreadsheet. 3 states, a net worth that my mother would not have had a word for in either of the languages she moved between. I thought about calling her. I held the phone for a while. I thought about what I would say and what she would say and how the conversation would move and where it would end. I put the phone down. Here is what I need to tell you about Aunt Baisoy. She called me 6 weeks after the case closed. This surprised me. Baisoy was not a caller. She was a presence, a witness, a woman who occupied rooms without shaping them. She said, "Zara, I want to talk to you. Not about the case. About your mother." I said, "Okay." She said, "She talks about you every day now. Not the way she used to talk about you. Differently. She tells people about you. What you do. What you have built. She tells it the way she used to tell Khalad's story. Like it belongs to her." I said nothing. Baisoy said, "I know that is complicated for you to hear. I know it might even make you angry. But I am telling you because I think you should know that she understands now. She may not know how to cross the distance, but she understands." I said, "I know she understands." Baisoy said, "Then what is stopping you?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. I said, "Baisoy, for 7 years she used my name as a cautionary tale. At every table. In every room. She used my name to tell a story about failure, and she told it with warmth, so it landed softly and stayed permanently. And now she tells people about my portfolio, about my credentials, about the trustee appointment. She tells it the way she used to tell Khalad's story." I paused. I said, "She is proud of what I have. She was ashamed of who I was, and I am not sure she understands the difference between those two things. I am not sure she has asked herself whether there is a difference. And until she does, until she can sit across from me and account for the years rather than simply replace the story with a better one, I don't know what there is to cross the distance toward." Baisoy was quiet. Then she said, "That is fair." I said, "I know it is." We hung up. I have not spoken to my mother since the corridor. I think about calling. Regularly. On Sunday mornings especially. The old rhythm of the call. The sound of her voice. The specific smell of a childhood kitchen that no longer exists in any building I can visit. I think about it. I have not done it. People expect stories like this to end in one of 2 ways. They expect the triumph, the moment of public vindication, the room full of people who dismissed you finally seeing you, the embrace, the tears, the reconciliation that wraps the wound in something that looks like healing. Or they expect the permanent rupture, the door closed, the number blocked, the clean, final exit that transforms the grief into something manageable by making it complete. What they do not expect, what nobody tells you about, in all the stories you consume about families and betrayal and the long, slow work of building a life in the face of dismissal, is the third option. The open wound. The door that is neither open nor closed. The phone you pick up and put down. The call you think about making on Sunday mornings in an apartment in a building you partially own. Looking at a city that knows your name in all the ways that matter professionally and not at all in the ways that matter personally. My mother is proud of me now. She tells people about me now. She used the word disappointment for 7 years, and now she uses different words, and she means them, and I believe that she means them. And it is not enough. Not because I am a hard person. Not because I am unwilling to forgive. Not because the wound has made me cold. It is not enough because recognition is not the same thing as repair. Because pride in what I have is not the same thing as understanding of who I am. Because the mother I needed at 29, standing at a dinner table in July with a plan and a dream, and the beginning of a life she could not see, that moment cannot be returned to. That version of the conversation cannot happen now. What can happen is something else. Something I do not yet have a name for. Something that begins, if it begins, not with her pride in what I've built, but with a conversation about the years, about what was said, about what it cost, about the words she used and what that word did to the space between us and what it would take. Not to close that space, maybe it doesn't close, but to stand in it honestly, together. That conversation has not happened. When it happens, if it happens, I will know. Until then, I am here. In my apartment, in my building, in my city, 3 states, a mother who is proud of me now, a daughter who is waiting for something more than pride. In your family, in the rooms you grew up in, was there a word someone used about you? A label, a verdict, a sentence delivered with warmth that landed permanently? That you are still carrying? Not because you are weak, because it was said by someone whose opinion was the weather of your world. And weather, when it is constant enough, doesn't feel like weather anymore. It just feels like the sky. If there is a word, if you know exactly what I am talking about, leave it in the comments. Not for me. For the next person who watches this and needs to know they are not the only one who built an empire just to prove a word wrong. And then kept building, even after the proof arrived, even when the proof was not enough. My name is Zara Mensicole. I am 36 years old. I am still building.